The silence was too thin. Calendro, this call sign Ren, pressed his cheek against the unforgiving shale, the rough grit biting into the exposed skin below his eye socket. He didn't need the AN-PVS-31s to see the difference. He felt the atmosphere change, thickening from the sterile, whole-toothed skull they expected to something warm and cloying, a mix of wood smoke, old spices, and too many unwashed, but they were too low. Then the sound came. It wasn't the wind, nor the crackle of their own radio chatter. It was a rhythmic, deep resonance, a human murmur amplified by the steep rock face of the valley below. Chanting, not the faint echo of a distant village, but a rolling, low-frequency hum that vibrated the very air in his lungs. "Ren, what is that?" Ghost whispered into the gums, his voice a strained filament of anxiety. Ghost was their heavy hitter, the point man. But here, the navigator was the center of the universe, and the universe had just tipped sideways. Ren thumbed the GPS unit, shielded by his body. The screen glowed an angry, sterile blue. The coordinates they had punched in, the pre-planned exfiltration point before the dry riverbed, were nowhere near this density. The topo map showed a desolate, uninhabited cluster of wadis. His indicator now showed density, and the altitude readout mocked him. "Grid reference is wrong." "Ghost," Ren hissed, the words tasting like metal dust. "Where off?" "Balichet Vija, azimuth 270. We should be seeing open sky." "What do you see?" Ghost's breathing crackled over the secure channel, ragged and fast. "Chief, I see lights. Not scattered, clustered. Too many damn lights. And traffic. Vehicular traffic. Heavy rigs moving. This isn't the staging zone. This is a city." A city! They were supposed to be miles from the nearest concentration of human life, a black hole, in the intelligence map. A place known only to nomads and the occasional desperate smuggler. Yet, below them, less than 500 meters down a treacherous scree slope, a pocket of humanity pulsed and breathed. It was too late for doubt. This was the moment before the lightning strike, the second before the detonation. Ren felt the oxygen drain from the air, leaving only the acrid smell of ozone and the realization of a catastrophic mistake. He was the one who had cross-referenced the corrupted intel file with the backup SAT imagery. He was the one who had led his three-man fireteam, Reaper, and Rook down the wrong, twisting goat path during the critical phase of the infiltration. They hadn't just taken a wrong turn on a dirt road. They had stepped off the map and landed in the lap of the enemy. The chanting intensified, swelling with fervor, mixed now with the high-pitched, abrasive sound of a loudspeaker echoing from the center of the dark mass. The vibrations weren't just in the air, they were in the ground. Ren felt them through his chest plate, through the tips of his boots dug into the loose rock. The temperature was rising. His sweat, cold moments ago, was turning slick and burning. He tightened his grip on the M4A1, the polymer stock slick. He could practically taste the chalk and limestone dust mixing with the faint, sickening scent of diesel fuel and old blood, the specific smell of a place that had seen too much warfare, too much preparation. This place wasn't just occupied, it was fortified. Ren closed his eyes for a split second, trying to rewind the last 3 hours, searching for the micro moment of failure. Was it the ravine they crossed? The confusing fork where the trail markers dissolved into loose stone. He had calculated the drift, compensated for the degraded inertial navigation. Or so, he thought. He pressed the mute button on his comms, needing one clean, unadulterated second of silence against the rising din below. The world narrowed to the rapid, painful hammering of his own heart against his ribs. If this was Al-Masil, the infamous village they had been briefed never to approach within a 10-kilometer radius, then they weren't just compromised. They were dead men walking, for ghosts already halfway into their own funeral procession, and the heavy, metallic, humid air itself felt like the roof of a deep grave. He had to get them out. "Now, listen up," Ren whispered back into the comms, his voice raw despite the low volume. "We move laterally. Up the screen. We need high ground and visual confirmation of an escape route. No radio transmission. Total blackout. If they have the capacity to monitor this area, they have the capacity to pinpoint us." He didn't wait for confirmation. He slid his body upward, the loose shale cascading silently below him. Every movement was a betrayal of their position. Every breath was a risk. He could see Ghost now, a squat shadow 50 feet ahead, pressed deep into the shadows of an overhang, his silhouette merging with the jagged rock face. The chanting below abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was the absolute, deafening void that precedes an ambush. Ren froze, every muscle fiber locked, heart hammering a desperate, internal code. It looped down his vision, cutting through the gloom. A single, powerful spotlight not from the village, but from a fortified position, slightly above, it raked across the hillside, sweeping rapidly across the terrain. Closer and closer to their position, the cold truth of isolation hit him harder than any physical blow. They were miles into hostile territory, off script, and standing on the very edge of the abyss, far from any help he could summon. What a terrifying place to stand alone. Kellen Rhodes was a Chief Petty Officer, SEAL Team 5. His specialization was intelligence and navigation, the man who stitched the fragments of satellite imagery, human sources, and digital whispers into a coherent map. He wore the responsibility like a vest of lead. 2 days ago, they had extracted a high-value SETA physicist from a compound deep inside this unmapped region. The mission, codenamed Spectre Run, had been flawlessly executed, clean and fast. The extraction phase was the easy part. The challenge was the 80 kilometers of arduous terrain to the extraction helicopter. The physicist was currently miles away, in the custody of a separate recovery team. Ren's fire team Alpha 4 was merely the phantom support, establishing a false trail, securing the exfil route, and confirming the area was sterile for follow-on forces. Their current position was supposed to be a remote, abandoned quarry, a perfect hiding spot until the primary forces were clear. Instead, they were pinned above Al-Masil. Al-Masil. The very name was a curse word in the briefing room. It wasn't just a village. It was the nerve center of the regional militia hardline, a fanatical group known for its sophisticated IED networks and surprising heavy armament. Their intelligence profile indicated a recent and severe hardening of the local defenses, suggesting they had either acquired better foreign technology or were expecting a major offensive. Ren knew they were in a place bristling with enemy eyes, acoustic sensors, and dedicated radio intercept teams. Ren glanced at his team through the night vision, each profile rigid against the harsh landscape. There was Ghosts, Sergiante Sanholt, the Masid Pointman, Former Force, Recon Naucio. He was calm, focused, a rock of muscle and training, currently scanning the slope with a thermal monocular. Ghost had a wife and 2 daughters back in San Diego. Ren often thought about that, the sheer volume of unprotected civilian life, riding on Ghost's flawless execution of violence. Reaper, Petty Officer, First Class, Samira Khan was the comms expert and designated sniper. She was the youngest, the most volatile, and ironically, the most precise. She held the long rifle steady, her breathing controlled, waiting for an instruction that might condemn them all. And Rook P.O. to Marcus Cole, the heavy weapons specialist. Rook was always smiling, even in the worst scenarios, but his face was now a tight mask of disbelief and tension. Rook carried the weight of the M240B. The gun was a promise, but also a tremendous liability if they had to run light. The weight pressing on Ren wasn't just the operationals, it was the face of Petty Officer First Class Dave Digger Miller, the man Ren had convinced to take a dangerous Overwatch position 2 months ago in Afghanistan. Digger had been killed by a mortar strike exactly 73 days ago. Ren survived because he had insisted Digger take that specific, exposed location. The shadow of that mistake, that calculus of error, never left him. Every calculation, every step, every GPS lock was now filtered through the phantom weight of Digger's death. Don't kill them, too. Not because of my mistake. The spotlight below them stopped its lateral sweep, settling not on the ridge where they were hiding, but on a point maybe 200 meters lower, illuminating the winding track leading into the village. They could now clearly see the outline of a permanent check, heavy machine gun emplacements, and at least a dozen armed figures. Not the usual local militia, but disciplined, uniformed soldiers. They're professional, Reaper whispered, her voice tight. That's heavy infantry cheat. Not the local farmer group. Ren confirmed the observation through his scope. These were the elite of the enemy force, possibly foreign advisors, certainly with. The uniforms were clean, the movements precise. They were guarding something. Ghosts. How far to the lowest road? Ren asked. About 350 meters. Chief. But it's a bull. We go down, we are trapped. We go up. We hit sheer rock face after 100 meters. They were in a saddle point, the worst tactical position imaginable. Too high to hide, too low to run. The air smelled strongly of sulfur now, mixed with the damp, earthy odor of the high desert after a cold night. The ground beneath Ren's hands felt strangely warm, radiating a low heat that wasn't solar. He shifted slightly, peeling away a camouflage drape and touching the rock. It was slightly slick with oil. Reaper. Check thermal signature of the road. Scanned for recent engine heat. Heavy loads. Reaper's reply was instant, her voice dropping to a serious, almost fatalistic tone. Chief, there's residual heat. Massive, not just small trucks. Semi-trailers. Multiple pasas in the last few hours. And, the whole central plateau down there is hot. Uniformly hot. Like concrete poured over a fresh bake. Ren's gut tightened. Concrete poured over a fresh bake. That wasn't just troop movement. That was construction. Rapid, sophisticated fortification. The intel had been worse than incomplete. It was dangerously outdated. Almacia wasn't just a village to be avoided. It was the active, central hub for something massive, a command center, a staging area, or worse, a storage facility for the hyperadic technology they had just risked their lives to protect. They hadn't just taken a wrong turn. They had stumbled directly onto the heart of the spiderweb. And then, a new sound cut through the oppressive silenza, muffled, pneumatic whomp. The sound of a mortar tube being dropped. Close. Ren looked at the village below. The windows of the central mosque structure now flashing with intermittent, sharp light, the distinct, repeating signature of a long-range radio transmitter being keyed on and off. They were activating the defenses. They know something's wrong, Ren stated, though he couldn't explain how. They had maintained radio silence for 12 hours. Their approach was stealthy, low profile, and utterly undetectable by conventional means. Unless, unless the whole area was a trap waiting to be sprung, and their arrival was merely the final, necessary piece of the puzzle. The weight of Digger Miller's death suddenly felt insignificant next to the crushing horror of having led his entire team into a catastrophic or predetermined kill zone. Ren knew what had to happen next. They couldn't stay. They couldn't go back the way they came, and they absolutely could not engage the hardened forces below. They needed a ghost exit, a vanishing act so impossible it required an act of sheer madness. Rook, Ren whispered, eyes fixed on the illuminate checkpoint. We're making a hard ascent. Prepare to ditch anything non-critical. 3 magazines, max. No ghost, you're on point. Find the fissure in the high rock. Reaper, Kavara 6. But only fire if you see their eyes. He paused, gathering the heavy, choking pressure in his chest. The extraction route is compromised. We're going north, through the red zone. This is a cold extraction now. No birds. We walking 120 kilometers through the red zone. An unpopulated stretch of mountains known for roving patrols and bandit gangs was a death sentence, but a slower one than staying put. As Ren prepared to move, his scope picked up movement in the village center. A vehicle, heavily armored, was pulling out, heading toward the checkpoint, moving slowly up the grade toward them. The hunt had begun. The heavy armored vehicle, a repurposed Soviet BTR, was grinding up the track. Its engine sounded deep, throbbing threat that echoed off the rock walls. It was methodical, slow, and purposeful. It was checking the outer perimeter, an indicator that the enemy below wasn't randomly patrolling. They were systematically hunting something they knew was there. Ren tightened the straps of his pack, the weight now feeling unbearable, a collection of useless gear dragging him down. He initiated the ascent, following Ghost's lead, climbing rapidly but carefully across the loose, treacherous shale. They moved for 5 breathless minutes, gunning maybe 40 meters in elevation. The slope here was a 45-degree angle, requiring hands and knees, clawing at brittle rock that threatened to give way with every ounce of pressure. The smell of diesel from the BTR was thick in the air, closer now. Then came the first mistake, not a tactical error, but a flaw in the terrain, exacerbated by the speed of their movement. Rook, hauling the M240B, placed his left boot on what he thought was a solid outcrop. It wasn't. It was a slab of laminated slate, maybe 6 inches thick, resting on nothing. The rock groaned, splintered, and gave way with a sickening crack. Rook didn't fall, but the subsequent cascade of rock did. Hundreds of pounds of shale, dirt, and stone tumbled down the slope below him, gathering momentum and noise. The sound was like 1,000 breaking ceramic plates, deafening in the otherwise controlled silence of the ascent. The spotlight from the BTR, which had just passed the 250-meter mark below, snapped around instantly. The beam hit the slope where the dust cloud was still rising, cutting through the thin air like a razor. Contact, Ghost roared, dropping to cover behind a massive, triangular boulder just above Ren. The muzzle flash from the BTR's turret mounted weapon followed the light instantly. Not the heavy main cannon, but the coaxial 7.62 millimeters machine gun. The rounds hit the rock a meter below Rook, tearing divots from the slope, spitting fire and fragments. The sound was a hideous, rapid tearing of the atmosphere. Reaper suppressing fire. Now, Ren screamed, simultaneously pulling out his smoke grenade. Reaper didn't hesitate. The distinctive crack of her silenced Mk11 Mod 0 rifle cut through the din. She didn't aim for the light or the gunner. She targeted the single, fragile link of the external radio antenna mounted on the BTR's roof. Crack, crack, crack! The third round found its mark. The antenna snapped, whipping uselessly against the armor plating. The immediate, chaotic chatter of the BTR crew over the radio vanished, replaced by a desperate, panicked shriek of static. Ren pulled the pin on the smoke grenade high output, designed to confuse thermal as well as visual spectrums, and hurled it downhill, aiming for the area just above the BTR's visual field. A second later, a thick, greasy plume of gray and white smoke erupted, swallowing the lower section of the hillside. But the BTR commander wasn't stupid. He didn't wait for the smoke to clear. He knew the general direction. The heavy cannon barked. WH-UMP. Crack. An 82mm high explosive round struck the rock face directly above Ghost, showering them all in concrete shrapnel and superheated air. The concussion hammered Ren, slamming him against the rock, his ears ringing with a painful, high-pitched whine. He could taste the sulfur and explosive residue. This was their first point of break. The element of surprise was gone. They were localized, engaged, and massively outgunned. Rook, status. Ren choked out, spitting dust. Up. Chief, I'm good. Just a scratch. Rook's voice was strained but clear. He had instinctively sheltered the machine gun with his body. Move. Move up. Now. Ren focused on the path ahead. They needed to gain the sheer cliff face. The Fisher Ghost had identified a narrow vertical chimney that might offer a chance to ascend out of the line of fire. It was slow, dangerous climbing, but the BTR couldn't elevate its weapon high enough to hit them once they were hugging the vertical wall. He grabbed the nearest piece of solid rock and began hauling himself up, Ghost already scrambling ahead like a mountain goat, driven by pure terror and operational necessity. Below, the heavy BTR was maneuvering, trying to get a clearer angle. Its spotlight sliced through the dissipating smoke, and then Ren heard the sound that truly froze his blood, a distinct, mechanical click, followed by the hiss of rushing air. Not from the BTR, not from the patrol below, it was from above them. Reaper, still covering their six, shouted a chilling warning. Chief, thermal signatures. High ground. We've got at least 4 men. They dropped down the fissure. The intel had been worse than outdated. It was completely inverted. Almaciel wasn't just fortified from the valley. The entire surrounding high ground was mined, monitored, and used as a forward observation post. Their path of escape was their path into the trap. The enemy hadn't reacted to the noise of the rock slide. They were already there, waiting. They had seen the fire team coming in, and the BTR was just driving them into the net. Ren stopped climbing, his body rigid against the rock face, sweat freezing instantly on his skin in the rising mountain chill. The muzzle flashes from above were sporadic, small arms fire, accurate, forcing Ghost and Rook to seek shallow cover. They were bracketed, heavy armor below, and entrenched, trained infantry above. They were pinned in a tactical vice, exposed on the open slope. The sheer isolation of their position, kilometers from any friendly support, amplified the terror. Ren felt a cold, analytical horror. This wasn't bad luck. This was a complete collapse of mission integrity. Ren checked the elevation. They were 120 meters up from the road, 80 meters below the fissure. They could not move forward. They could not move back. He realized the true horror of their situation. The enemy hadn't just predicted their presence. They had orchestrated their entry into this exact, fatal choke point. He took a deep breath, the metallic taste of gunpowder overwhelming everything. He needed to think. He needed an impossible solution. He needed to break the rulebook. What do you do when the entire world is against you and you stand on the brink of an unavoidable fall? The air crackled with a second round of distant chanting, louder this time, filtering up from the village below, a triumphant, eerie sound of anticipation, like spectators waiting for the curtain to drop on a tragedy. The pressure was instantaneous and crushing. The small arms fire from the ridge above was methodical, calculated to keep their heads down, pinning them to the slope, while the BTR below continued its slow, deliberate climb. preparing to bring its heavy fire to bear. Ren pressed his forearm into a crevice, stabilizing his shaking body. His mind, usually a clean, efficient mechanism, was racing with panicked options, each worse than the last. Option 1, break cover and sprint for the fissure. Probability of success: 0. They would be exposed to simultaneous fire from above and below. Guaranteed casualties. Option 2, retreat downhill and engage the BTR madness. They carried standard issue assault rifles and 1 light machine gun against thick armor plating. Option 3, hunker down and call for emergency air support. They were too deep. The skies were too controlled by the enemy, and the distance to the nearest airbase was prohibitive. A radio transmission now would confirm their position and bring every available enemy asset down on their heads. He needed a chaotic, asymmetrical solution. Something the professional infantry, the ones above and in the BTR, wouldn't expect. Ren glanced at Rook, who was trying to get a stable angle for the M240B. Frustration etched on his face. The big gun was useless against the armored vehicle unless they hit the optics, or a narrow Ventus shot, too delicate to attempt under this kind of pressure. Ren's eyes fell on the terrain below the BTR. The vehicle was advancing along a dusty track carved into the side of the mountain decades ago, designed for trucks hauling stone. The track itself was stabilized by retaining wall-stacked relayed stone at the lower edge. He remembered the smell, sulfur, and that distinct, pervasive scent of diesel, and the fact that the entire central plateau of Almasil was hot, radiating heat like a fresh bake. The wrong turn. The initial intelligence had been wrong about the location of the enemy and wrong about the nature of the terrain. Ren had made the navigation error, but the larger, institutional error was the intel profile. This wasn't just a militia camp, it was a logistics hub. He looked at the BTR again, inching closer, its turret beginning to elevate, searching for a firing solution. Time collapsed to a single, agonizing heartbeat. Ren gripped the 2 remaining fragmentation grenades attached to his plate carrier. Standard issue, M67, good blast radius, predictable fragmentation pattern. Useless against the BTR's armor. But what if they weren't aimed at the armor? The impossible decision formed in his mind, sharp and cold. It was complete insubordination, a violation of every principle of tactical engagement in a sensitive area, and absolutely suicidal. Ghost, Reaper, Rook. New plan. Forget the high ground. We are going down. Ren commanded, his voice barely a rasp, but carrying the force of sudden authority. Chief, you're insane. Dal means the BTR and the checkpoint, Ghost protested, dodging a cluster of rounds from above. We're not fighting the vehicle. Ghost, we're fighting the mountain. Rook, prepare 3 belts. Tracers last. Reaper, find me the thickest fuel container on that BTR secondary fuel drum. External mount, whatever. Reaper, despite the incoming fire, adjusted her scope. Affirmative, Chief. External jerrycans, and a visible fuel line running along the lower chassis plate. Starboard side. Perfect. Ren yanked a pin on both M67 grenades. He didn't activate the spoon. He needed the delay. Tego wasinti to explode on contact. The goal was to initiate a tactical, contained Rookslida massive, unstable cascade of stone directly onto the BTR's path. His breathing hitched. He focused on the memory of Digger Miller, the guilt that had been a silent, constant companion. This decision was reckless, but calculated. The only way to survive the trap was to destroy the terrain that had become their cage. I'm going for the retaining wall, 10 o'clock from the BTR, below the track level. It's dry laid stone. Ghost, I need cover fire on the high ridge to draw their fire away from my drop point. Reaper, be ready to take out that fuel line on my signal. Rook, when I give the code, you light up the side of the BTR with everything you have, tracers. Everything. Distract them from the road. Ren checked his watch. The BTR was 150 meters away. Closing. Execute in 3, 2. He took the most dangerous jump of his life. He didn't climb down. He launched himself laterally and slightly downward, using the momentum to swing across a vertical drop of maybe 20 feet, aiming for a small, barely visible ledge directly above the retaining wall, holding the road in place. He hit the ledge hard, the impact jolting his spine, his breath driven out in a painful whoosh. He barely registered the sharp retort of Ghost and Reaper's rifles opening up, diverting the attention of the snipers above. Ren landed, rolled, and immediately braced himself against the wall. He needed to be quick, precise, and utterly ruthless. The BTR was almost directly overhead, its heavy tracks vibrating the entire slope. Ren activated the first grenade, counting 1 second, then threw it underhand, not at the wall, but into the narrow gap behind the retaining wall, aiming for the loose soil and fill that held the structure in place. The second grenade followed immediately, aimed further down the slope. "Fire!" Ren screamed into the comms. Rook's M240B erupted in a terrifying, continuous roar, showering the side of the BTR with rounds. The sound was deafening, the tracers illuminating the darkness with neon streaks, forcing the BTR's heavy machine gunner to pivot away from Ren and engage Rook's position TSHH. The first grenade detonated deep in the fill. The retaining wall bucked violently, but held shaboom. The second grenade was the key. It struck the weakest point of the wall. The dry-laid stones groaned, shifted, and then the entire lower section of the retaining wall of hundreds of tons of rock and packed earth gave way with a monstrous, roaring sound. The BTR, already positioned on the outer edge of the track, was caught mid. The ground under its left tracks liquefied and collapsed into a massive landslide. The vehicle listed violently, the heavy armor pulling it down. Reaper. Fuel line. Now, Reaper, cool as ice despite the chaos, placed a perfect burst of 5.56mm rounds into the exposed fuel line. Diesel erupted in a violent spray against the hot engine block. The BTR slid, tilted 45 degrees, its heavy cannon barrel uselessly pointing at the sky. Ren didn't wait to see the inevitable. He scrambled back up the slope, propelled by adrenaline, the roar of the collapsing rock and the smell of raw fuel filling the air. He had created chaos. Now, they had a precious, non-repeatable window of 30 seconds to exploit the terror and darkness. The immediate consequence was pure, uncontrolled destruction. The armored vehicle, crippled and listing severely, began its long, agonizing roll down the precipitous slope. It tumbled end over end, a catastrophic mass of steel and momentum, ripping up the established track and taking more of the retaining wall with it. The engine, still running, screamed in protests. The crew inside, stunned by the sudden geological catastrophe, were useless. Seconds later, the superheated engine block met the exposed, vaporized diesel fuel. A blinding, orange-white fireball erupted from the BTR's chassis, immediately followed by the concussive whoomp of the fuel tank igniting. The explosion was so massive it momentarily silenced the small arms fire from the ridge above, the sound wave hitting Ren and his team like a physical punch. Ren, scrambling back up to Ghost and Rook, threw himself flat against the shale, shielding his eyes from the violent glare. The cascading wreckage below was now a torrent of burning metal and rock, plummeting towards the checkpoint near the village entrance. The enemy at the high ground position were temporarily paralyzed by the shock and the sudden, overwhelming inferno that illuminated the valley like a horrible sunrise. Reaper, now, suppress and cover, Ren ordered, his voice hoarse. Rook, ditch the 240. We're running light. Rook looked heartbroken, but discipline won. He unslung the M240B, placed it carefully at the base of the boulder, and grabbed only his M4A1 and his remaining magazines. The sound of their heavy support weapon being abandoned was a heavy, emotional weight. Reaper, using the sudden light from the burning BTR to her advantage, laid down an accurate burst of fire at the exposed positions on the high ridge. The enemy fire hesitated, briefly disorganized. We go up, Ren yelled. Ghost, find that fissure. We move faster than they can reposition. They sprinted, climbing desperately, using the shadows cast by the intense explosion as their only cover. The heat radiating upward from the burning wreckage was immense, mixing with the smell of scorched earth and melting plastic. Ren was driven by a cold terror now, not just of capture, but of failure. They had made a catastrophic error in navigation, but his decision to collapse the road had bought them maybe 2 minutes of disorganized enemy response. Ghost reached the fissure, first a dark, tight vertical chimney, maybe 4 feet wide, obscured by a dense layer of thorny scrub brush. Chief, it's tight, single file. Ren followed Ghost in, scrambling up the narrow chute. The rock was smooth and slick, polished by centuries of water runoff. They used friction and brute strength, ignoring the scraping of their gear against the stone. As Ren ascended, he heard the faint, distorted sound of a powerful radio transmission coming from the high ground above them, near the fissure's exit. He listened, straining his ears over his own ragged breathing. It wasn't the frantic, localized chatter he expected. It was a clear, calm, deep voice, speaking in flawless English, broadcast over a wide-band frequency. Alpha 4 team, designated Ren. You have performed exactly as predicted. We understand the necessity of your tactical disruption. Good effort on the BTR. However, the path ahead is secured. You have activated the failsafe. Abandon your ascent immediately. You are too late. Ren froze, heart slamming against his ribs. Predicted failsafe sequence? He realized the awful truth that only became clear when the operation had completely collapsed. The faulty intelligence, the wrong grid coordinates, the strange concentration of high-end infantry in Al-Masilat wasn't just a mistake. It was a setup. The extraction of the physicist 2 days ago hadn't been flawless. The physicist had been tracked. The enemy, or a sophisticated third party, had allowed the extraction to proceed, knowing the recovery team would rely on standard operating procedures, including the use of an advanced navigation chief like Ren to confirm the exfil path. The compromised coordinates Ren had navigated were a digital Brett, a phantom trail deliberately left to funnel a highly trained SEAL team, specifically a navigation and intel specialist, into this exact trap. The entire operation, Spectre Run, was compromised from the beginning. Ren was not just a navigator who took a wrong turn. He was the key, the final piece of confirmation the enemy needed. They hadn't been hunting the physicist, they had been hunting the intel stream itself, and they had used Ren to confirm the integrity of that stream. The realization was a punch to the soul. Digga Miller's death, the guilt he carried, the flawless execution he craved, all of it had led him to this calculated ambush. The voice crackled again, sounding closer now, resonating down the narrow rock chute. Chief Rhodes, the scientist you extracted, was a decoy. A valuable decoy, but a decoy nonetheless. Thank you for confirming our operational readiness. Now, stand down. We do not wish for unnecessary bloodshed, only necessary leverage. The silence that followed was broken by the metallic clicking of rifle bolts cycling above them, followed by the hiss of a heavy-duty climbing line descending rapidly down the fissure. They were sealing the exit. Ren looked at Ghost, who was clinging to the rock face just above him, his face illuminated by the flickering light of the distant fire. Ghost understood immediately. They weren't fighting militia, they were fighting shadows, and the shadows had calculated every move. Reverse, Ren yelled, scrambling backward, ignoring the pain in his knees and elbows. They're coming down. We go back down the slope. The chaos he had created was now the only way out. They had to plunge back into the darkness and smoke, back toward the burning wreckage and the reinforced checkpoint, hoping the fire would mask their escape into the massive debris field. The descent was more brutal than the climb. They slid, fell, and tumbled down the loose, unstable scree, aiming for the massive shadow cast by the burning BTR. The explosion had carved a fresh wound in the mountain face, a churning river of loose rock and pulverized dirt. They reached the edge of the blast. Zone a scorched, smoking landscape where the air was thick with the smell of burnt rubber, oil, and human tissue. Ren stopped, dropping flat onto the ground, coughing violently, the acrid smoke stinging his eyes. The enemy forces above were now fully engaged, but focused primarily on sealing the fissure. The checkpoint below was a beacon of disorganized activity, soldiers scrambling to assess the damage, pulling back from the heat and the unstable ground. The chanting from Al-Masil had ceased completely, replaced by the wail of sirens and the shouted commands of officers trying to restore order. Rook, cover the rear slope. Reaper, we need a path through the debris field. Now, Ren whispered. They moved like insects through the smoke and heat, following the edge of the collapsed track. The entire operational mandate had dissolved. Their mission was no longer surveillance or exfil support. It was survival, deep in a hostile fortress that had been prepared specifically for them. Ren moved past the twisted metal fragments of the BTR. He saw flashes of green light on the ground, shards of thermal imaging gear, shattered by the impact. He focused on the only path available, down towards the perimeter of Al-Masil, where the environment was most complex, and therefore their survival probability marginally higher. They used the darkness and the smoke, traversing a wadi choked with thorny brush. They had to be clean, silent, invisible. Every step was agonizing, every snapped twig a potential death knell. After what felt like hours, they reached the true red zone, the high-altitude plateau beyond the reach of Al-Masil's direct patrols. They were exhausted, bruised, and mentally shattered. Rook was dragging his feet. Reaper was silent, her jaw tight. Ghost walked with the strained vigilance of a man who knew they were still being hunted. Ren looked back one last time. The fire from the BTR was a distant orange glow against the deep black of the valley. A constant, ugly monument to his navigation error and the enemy's calculated trap. They walked for 3 days, covering 125 kilometers on foot, surviving on purification tablets and emergency rations, avoiding all roads and settlements. They moved only under the new moon, drinking melted ice runoff from the highest peaks. Finally, on the fourth morning, a pre-arranged high-altitude drone confirmed their existence. Hours later, a dedicated Special Operations Force extraction team found them exhausted. Broken shadows huddled in a rock cave, dehydrated and running on fumes. They were flown out in silence. No debrief was given on the aircraft, only cold water and medical assessments. Weeks later, back in Virginia, the atmosphere in the SEIF was sterile, cold, and utterly unforgiving. Wren sat across from the directorate, the air thick with unspoken accusation. The report was classified, short, and brutal. The operational failure was attributed to a multi-layered, state-sponsored counterintelligence initiative. The physicist they had extracted was indeed a decoy, used to confer the travel corridor and the protocols of the US SOF teams operating in the region. The wrong turn, the corrupted coordinates in Wren's navigation file was traced not to a software glitch, but to a zero-day exploit embedded months before. Wren was the most meticulous navigator. His failure guaranteed the team would follow the corrupted path, because he was the most likely to trust the system over his gut. The loss of the BTR was officially a significant tactical loss for the enemy, but the cost to the US side was irreparable. For highly trained operators compromised, their methods revealed, and their operational windows drastically reduced. Wren was cleared of disciplinary action. There was no negligence, there was merely superior enemy planning. He stood by the window of the debriefing room, looking out at the manicured lawn. He was alive. Ghost, Reaper, and Rook were alive. They were medically sound, physically intact, but the ghost of the Gamila was now joined by the specter of Al-Masil. Wren asked the directorate a single question, quiet and raw. What was in Al-Masil? The director, an old, tired man with the rank of admiral, paused for a long time, shuffling a sheaf of papers. He didn't look at Wren. We don't know, Chief. But the day you took the wrong turn and forced the explosion. We lost all acoustic and thermal surveillance on that location for 48 hours. The heavy heat signature Reaper noted, it vanished. When we got eyes back on, the plateau was clean. Everything they were building, or storing, was gone. Wren nodded slowly. The enemy hadn't just lured them into a trap. They had used the four of them their training. Their desperate need for survival. Wren's reckless decision to collapse the Rodas, a highly effective, deeply penetrating operational screen. The explosion, the chaos, the distraction night was all the time the enemy needed to extract whatever high-value asset, technology, or person they were protecting. Wren hadn't saved his team by collapsing the road. He had served the enemy's final purpose. He was the most effective, most regrettable instrument of their success. He walked out into the cold Virginia air, the taste of metallic dust and diesel still phantom on his tongue. The worst kind of failure is the kind that looks like success. The one that feels like a bitter, hollow victory. What is the weight of a correct coordinate?